What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about features that must be added to Madden franchise modes in-season free agency for future Maddens. Now, these are things that I consider to be relatively basic additions to the game that are actually in various other EA games, and I'm going to try to point towards those in today's video. However, I want to first start by taking a look at the in-season free agency tools that we have available to us now, and essentially what has been available to us for the past decade, because those tools haven't changed. The way free agency operates during the preseason and regular season has not changed in Madden at all over that time period. Simply what you do, you go to your roster, you go to free agency for Madden 22 specifically, but once you go to free agency, all you have to do if you're trying to add a free agent, you click on that player and you hit sign to active roster. And all it does for you is it automatically signs that player to a 1-year contract that has no bonus and has a predetermined salary value. Now, what I do believe that they did this year was they worked on the logic of this salary value a little bit within the game. However, there are some major issues that I think can be improved upon and should be addressed for future Madden games. The first couple of these features, which are actually in other EA games that they could definitely go in-house to their other EA studios that create their various other games, especially NHL, for example, and take a look at what those guys are doing with their game, is, a couple of contract demand type of features and things like that are going to improve the negotiation process here with these players. As I said here earlier in the video, all you have the ability to do is offer a 1-year predetermined amount of money to this player, and that can create a somewhat unrealistic dynamic because not all free agents that are signed in the preseason and regular season are signed to, a 1-year, $3 million contract or anything like that. Sometimes these guys will take the veteran minimum to just get on a contract. Sometimes these guys will try to negotiate a longer contract, and that's why they haven't signed yet. And maybe they're looking for a team that wants a longer contract, or maybe they have some specific demands for signing with a team in order to, get a deal done. So, quickly jumping over to NHL 22's free agency here, I wanted to show you guys some of the options that are available within free agency within this game. So if we wanted to sign one of the top free agents to a contract here within the game, there are a couple of requirements from this player. There's also a contract demand from this player and the ability to negotiate that contract with the player. So my top two additions or changes that need to be made, that absolutely must be made in order to revive franchise mode, and like I said, I don't think these are super difficult changes, is number one, there need to be contract demands, which are already in various other EA games and other sports titles, and there needs to be playing time or depth chart requirements for signing these players. And the reason that I say that is because that is much more realistic. Whenever we take a look at Eric Stahl here, for example, he is demanding a certain amount of money. I can offer him less than his demanded amount of money, or I can offer him more than his demanded amount of money. What that entails is you can try to lowball offer some of these free agents to try to influence them to join maybe a more competitive team that has less money, or you can throw more money at them to try to influence them to join your team over somebody else's team. Either way, there is a negotiation process there, and you can also offer them more than a 1-year contract. In addition to that, as you guys can see right here, the player expects a certain role whenever signing with your team. For example, this player wants to have a specific role on the team. If you want to sign one of the top free agents, they're going to expect to be a top 4 defenseman on your team. And if you don't do that, it is going to influence their morale within your system. And so I think that could be influenced in multiple ways in Madden. Specifically, let's say I was trying to sign a top cornerback that's out here in free agency like Quan Williams, then maybe he is desiring to at least be a starting corner on the team, or maybe he's desiring to at least be a third corner on the team so he gets on the field in passing sets, or maybe he desires to be second string at the very least, or something of that nature. And that could influence whether he signs with your team versus somebody else's team, or could influence the morale and the chemistry of the team that you already have existing. So you could have opportunities where a team might be able to give him a higher position than he's asking for, and that could influence him to sign to your team. And like I said, I believe that a lot of these changes can also overflow to off-season free agency, and this one specifically is something that could overflow to off-season free agency and add more dynamic to signing free agents in the off-season and deciding which teams they go to. A certain team might be able to offer a top free agent millions and millions of dollars that another team can't necessarily offer them, but that team might not have him be the number one player at that position, whereas the other team that can't offer as much money might be offering him a bigger role. That significantly plays into players' decisions within the NFL, within free agency and off-season free agency and everything like that, so I believe it should be a staple of the game, considering it's also in various other sports titles, including EA games. Jumping back over to NHL real quick, I want to bring up my third point that needs to be addressed for future Maddens, and that is a true waivers system. There is no waiver system currently within Madden. There has not been a waiver system. However, again, in various other EA games and other sporting titles out there, you have to place players on waivers whenever you cut them or whenever you pass them to a minor league system. So you guys can see here, there is a waiver eligibility category for all of these players within the NHL roster, and they're either eligible for waivers or not. And that's a major impact on moving players, making roster moves within your franchise, because you have to think about whether you want this player to be potentially claimed by another team on waivers or not. And from the other side of things, teams have access to claim these players off of the other teams because that could help out their squad. For example, OBJ, when he was released from the Browns, had to pass through waivers before he was ever able to be a free agency and sign with another team. A team very well could have claimed him off waivers if they desperately needed that player and saw him as a good fit for their team. Now, my understanding is that does not necessarily mean that he has to play for that team. There are a couple of loopholes around it, but having a waiver system in the game, when a waiver system exists in real life, is probably a basic concept that should be involved with Madden 23 or whichever Madden games we're getting moving forward. I believe that a waiver process would actually help to balance franchises within Madden because it's going to give access to better players that are cut from teams to the lower overall teams first. It is going to create more balance within franchises, especially franchises in which there are not all user teams. In franchises where there's only a couple users and a lot of CPU teams, a lower overall CPU team that could really use a player would probably end up with priority on the waiver order and be able to claim a high overall player if they're cut, even if they're not the greatest player in the world. Let's say it's maybe just like a 75 overall player. A team might really be able to use that player rather than allowing that player to fall to free agency, and then those user teams that are already probably OP picking that player up as a backup or something like that. Instead, that player could become a starter on another team. So I think a waiver priority system, a waiver order system, may go a long way into improving Madden's franchise mode. Now, I know that not a lot of teams in real life actually claim players on waivers, but I do believe it should at least be a system within the game that is available to be used, because I think for franchise mode itself, a lot of people might consider picking players up on waivers in comparison to the way the NFL operates. The next thing that I want to talk about here is an improved system for preventing players from constantly signing free agents to fill voids on their team, because that doesn't happen in real life and it's a little bit unrealistic. And I feel like there is a pretty simple way to address that within Madden franchise mode itself. You could put in some type of a system where a player has to learn the playbook before they can ever play for your team, or they need to have a skills reduction whenever signed to your team for a temporary amount of time while they are learning the playbook. So for example, if my starting quarterback went down, a lot of people would then go out to free agency to sign a quarterback to play in that player's place that very week, instead of playing maybe their backup or going to their practice squad and finding a practice squad player that they could utilize that week that probably knows the playbook better and has been with the system for a while and is the realistic way that teams utilize those players that are already within their organization to fill that role. And I find that to be unrealistic, that everybody's first instinct is to go out to free agency because it's just available to you and it's an easy solution. And I understand why people do it, because I'd rather go pick up a 72 overall than play a 68 overall, especially if that 72 overall has a better skill set and is going to help my team win. However, I believe that franchise mode would benefit from some immersion if they added some type of detriment to going out and doing that, and made it more likely, or made it a benefit to pick up a player from your practice squad or play a player that's already on your roster, as opposed to going out and getting a free agent. And like I said, all that has to look like is maybe you sign the player and they sit for a week, or maybe you sign the player and they have a reduction to a couple of their skills that is going to make them a significantly lower overall until they learn the playbook or something like that. And it's going to influence people to then utilize the players that are already on their roster and utilize their practice squads properly, as opposed to just simply going out and signing Andy Dalton or Drew Lock or Robert Griffin III and dropping them into their lineup that very same week and playing them as if they knew the playbook the entire time and could do everything at the same level as somebody that was already in the system and has the same knowledge of that system. So I definitely believe that that is a simple add to franchise mode that, I mean, I know that, I say that a lot of these things are simple, but in comparison to a lot of the other demands of people whenever we're talking about franchise mode in Madden, I don't think that this is something that should be all that complicated to add. In fact, I don't think any of these things I've talked about so far should be particularly complicated to add, because they are generally not all that involved in terms of a concept. They are relatively straightforward. And then finally, what I want to talk about is actually talking about the CPU logic in terms of who they sign to their team and who they leave out here in free agency. Now, I know that in user leagues, a lot of players like Kareem Jackson, for example, and some of these veteran cornerbacks and whatnot are going to just end up out here in free agency because nobody wants the older players, nobody wants the slower players. You're at a disadvantage if you have these players on your roster. However, I feel like CPU teams within franchise mode should prioritize adding these players to their team. And even if at a backup level, adding these players to their team to improve what they have on their roster. Because right now, like Jason Verrett, for example, is not a bad corner by any means. He's got reasonable athleticism. However, I could go out here to any number of CPU teams within the league and see, well, they would be better off with one of those guys on their roster. However, we're in week 4 now, and a lot of these teams just simply don't want to have these guys on their roster, even as a backup. A lot of these teams would benefit to have one of those guys as opposed to some of the guys that are already on their roster. For example, the Browns here, I mean, there's an argument to be made that they don't need one of those corners, but they could certainly cut the 25-year-old 66 overall that's never going to develop on their team because he's not going to play, and they could bring in an 80 overall player that might give them a bonus even if they want to utilize him as a backup or something like that. There are various teams here that I think would benefit from adding these players to their roster. Here's a good example again, the Cardinals, who have an injury to their 75 overall cornerback. They do have a rookie 71, but after that, there's really not a lot here that they're benefiting from. So maybe they should go out and sign one of those cornerbacks. However, we have somehow gotten all the way to week 4 in this franchise, and all of those players are still available and not picked up by those teams. Now, another factor here is the salary cap situation within the game. The CPU's logic in terms of signing players is still pretty rough. Not as good as it could be, and they limit themselves on salary cap. A lot of teams are close to, if not negative on salary cap, so they can't pick these players up anyway. So the CPU logic still needs major improvements, and I know that this one is probably more involved than any of the other suggestions or the other imperatives that I've had on this list so far. I would not expect this to be perfect, but it is still something that needs to be worked on and needs to be on the list of priorities to fix within the game, because once you get a couple years into a franchise, even 1 year into a franchise, this is the type of stuff that happens, and it's a little bit odd and takes out the immersiveness of franchise mode. So that's what I wanted to address here in today's video, just a couple of things that in my opinion have to be added to franchise mode or have to be changed for franchise mode in the future, especially if they really want people to stick around and keep playing their game. And some of these things I really don't think are that difficult to address, especially considering they're in other games that EA develops themselves. And I know that they have different studios and whatnot, but there should be some communication going on about how did you guys involve this in your game and how can we involve it in our game type of stuff. There just needs to be improvement on this end. I want to hear your guys' comments down in the comment section below. Are there other things you'd like to address? Do you like any of these ideas? Please let me know that stuff in the comment section below. As always, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new around here. I'll see you guys in the next one, and I hope you have a good one.